no fap or semen retention could potentially be dangerous if not approached in the proper way.
We come into the world from being fully at home and feeling that release that comes. We have a little shadow of it when we come home at the end of a day, those of you that have a home, whatever that is, that feeling of coming home or coming to a safe space or feeling back at peace or at one. And when we get separated from that, and that separation, I want to keep reiterating, is created by the mind. That's what the basic issue of the ignorance that is the root of suffering that the Buddha keeps pointing out. Basic root of suffering is thought, the clinging of the mind to things which separate one from all of it. Now, once that separation has occurred, there is incredible pain. We can call it being thrown out of the Garden of Eden, we can call it original sin, whatever you want to call that. I mean, there are different metaphors within different systems. But there is incredible pain, and in some profound way, all of our actions henceforth are an attempt to return to that, for me, under Maharaji's blanket, or in the heart of God, or in the hand, or being the one, coming back into the one. And we develop a whole set of techniques that we say make us feel good, give us a feeling for the moment of, yeah, ah. And some of those give us that moment so intensely, and the rest of our life is so much pain of our separateness and so devoid of that feeling, that once we find one of those things, for example, it might be a moment of sexual orgasm, it might be a moment of surfing when you transcend the dualism between you and nature, it could be when you're doing something like cooking, the way you turn into just the joy of the process. It could be any number of things. That when that occurs, it reinforces the behavior, and you start to do that behavior more and more because it feels good. It takes away the pain of the separateness. And the use of drugs, the use of material possessions, the use of relationships, all of it, when you get busy and get obsessed with relationships and wanting to get closer and closer to somebody, it is trying to get to the place where you come back into that oneness. It's that yearning, and you can feel it permeate the universe of people's consciousness. When you look at addictions from that point of view, you see that it's not like evil, it is just an attempt to get back. The problem is that most behaviors that get you back is like what Maharaji said about drugs. He said it will allow you to be in the presence of Christ, but you can only stay 2 hours. He said it would be better to become Christ than visit him. And that's what you find out with most addictive things, that they give you a short rush, but they don't allow you to remain at home. They just allow you the taste of it. And then the minute you get thrown out because you weren't wearing the wedding garment, the minute you go back to heaven but you can't stay because you didn't come in through the right way, you end up feeling like I did something wrong, I'm bad. And then that starts a reaction of mind, so that you come down, then you feel guilt, I must be bad, I should have done something else. Why didn't I do the practices that would have allowed me to stay there rather than the thing that's short term? Because you see your predicament. What happens is that the opportunity for the immediate gratification, it's like what's called in the psychology, the choice of the little candy bar now or the big candy bar later. And with little children, they'll always grab for the little candy bar now because they want what they can get now. They don't have any delay of gratification. And spiritual practices, compared to having sex or compared to taking Coke or something, is more like delayed gratification versus immediate gratification. So when you start to stand back and see your predicament and see what you're doing, there is a way from a spiritual perspective in which you begin with that slight bit of awareness to extricate yourself from the chain of reactivity that we're talking about. The chain of reactivity that goes from, I'm feeling this hunger, and then I'll go for the gratification, and then and then the coming down, and then oh shit, and then I should have done it the other way, and then I'm bad, and there's a whole chain of thoughts that go on. Every one of those is just keeping the whole process going. And as you develop the spaciousness, you start to look at where you can intervene in the process of the sequence that goes on. As the awareness gets deeper, you intervene at different places in the sequence. For example, the yearning, the hunger starts, and like for me, for example, I've had strong addictions to food, so that when I am feeling unloved, I'll eat, and I'll get fat. It's a pattern. And then I'll hate myself, loathing because of my body and so on. And I'll go through it. Now, I understand the psychodynamics of that at one level, but let's take it from this point of view of the mind for a moment. The first place I began to intervene was when Manindra, my meditation teacher, said, Ram Dass, don't you see that it's just old karma running off? And I began to break in at the point that after I had eaten too much to reduce my anxiety because my mother fed me food when I was upset, and I learned that pattern and all that stuff, I start to, instead of going into I'm no good and revulsion and all the sequence, I break the chain at that point, and then I just go back into my spiritual practices. Okay? Instead of carrying out that whole sequence, I shortcut there. As the witness gets stronger, you start to go back in the chain further and further until as the separateness is starting to come and the feeling of hunger, and as you're about to eat, you start to notice the fact that you're about to do that, and your mind anticipates the whole sequence, and you, in a sense, begin to see the emptiness of the form you're about to take. Now, if you try to stop it too soon using your mind to stop it, there's a residual backlash from it. And generally, when people come to me with addictions, I'm inclined to say, start doing spiritual practices. Start doing the studies that will allow you to see yourself in a new way, that will allow you to understand what that hunger is you're feeding in a new way, to just get a little different perspective on it. Don't worry about the addiction. It will fall away when it will fall away. And when you do it again, just notice it. And the line I always used, how poignant I am. How poignant the human condition. You know, I'm so gentle with myself. And what I have watched is the patterns of my obsessions and addictions have changed over time. There's no doubt about that. And yet I didn't deal with them directly head on for the most part. Because what you see is, and this is something that I'm sure I create a lot of waves in many people, including people that I love very dearly, that I'm close to. I see that a lot of the programs to deal with addiction end up creating a new addiction to being not addicted that is as bad as the addiction itself. That, I mean, when you meet somebody that says, I haven't smoked in 3 years, 2 months, 10 days, and 4 hours, you realize that their mind is as stuck as their mind was stuck in smoking. Maybe they won't die of cancer, but they'll probably die of uptightness.
The way I look at this kind of scenario, where we are running away from something and trying to run toward something else. Let's say in this instance, pornography. Imagine that this is the attachment that we have. And so imagine a rubber band, and we're trying to run away from that attachment, but the attachment still has a hold of us. So as we try and run and escape, eventually the pressure of life, it gets too much, And so the moment we crack, or the moment the stress becomes too heavy, is the moment we snap back to our attachment, to our pre-programmed pattern of behavior, that addiction or that habit that we've built over a long time. And so oftentimes we can relapse even worse. Sometimes after having a long streak of being successful, we could find ourselves worse in our addiction than ever before. Now, I should say first and foremost that the problem with No Fap is that the name itself is problematic. Because what they really mean, or the purpose behind the movement, is to stop watching pornography. Fapping is not necessarily the problem. It is about the intentions in which you approach the action. So if you demonize fapping, you begin to get distracted from the actual problem. Even though it can be good to abstain from these kinds of things altogether, to go down a path of celibacy, we have to get to the root of the understanding of why this is important in the first place, or why there is a No Fap movement, or why pornography is bad. So to clarify, we can understand that as a man, one of the most powerful forms of life energy that we have is our seed. It takes a large amount of resources to produce semen in the body. And so if you are wasting it all the time, then your body is in a constant state of trying to replenish this fluid. And so your body remains in this kind of depleted state. And to put it simply, the less life energy you have, the more you will feel like death. Because where life is, death is not. And where death is, life is not. So it really comes down to preserving your life energy. Without this energy, it becomes very difficult to have any motivation to do anything, to reach for a higher purpose or higher dreams and goals. It becomes more and more difficult just to live your daily life. And the moment you add pornography into the mix, then you are headed for a downward spiral of death. Because not only is the life energy being drained from you, but strong negative information is being stored in your body. Because when we pair strong emotions and strong visuals or patterns, our body stores that information, it remembers. And so too, psychologically, our relationship with sex and sexuality and sexual energy becomes distorted. Our sexual instinct becomes maladapted and perverted. And energy that is directed in a way that's not healthy can be absolutely destructive. Because energy is energy. It can be used to destroy or it can be used to create, depending on where that energy is focused. But I would say if you are on this journey of No Fap or semen retention, one of the biggest keys is to remain non-attached, whether you relapse or not. Because the moment you begin adding on to yourself shame and guilt and fear, the moment those negative emotions begin to just take more and more of a toll on your body, on your psychology, on your mind. And so beating yourself up doesn't help. It does nothing but make the problem worse. And so if one is able to remain stoic during this process, one has the greatest opportunity for change and growth. But if one acts in a way of desperation, desperately trying to run away from relapsing or this addiction, the problem is that you are still attached to it. Therefore, it still has a grip on you. And no matter how far you run, no matter how far you go, there will still be that connection. And so the key is to sever that connection. And this can be dangerous because you may still be stuck in this pattern of behavior. And by removing your attachment to it, by removing the fear and the shame and the guilt, you no longer have the emotional motivator to get you to avoid that certain action. But this is not an easy problem to solve. But you see, we are able to enter into a higher paradigm, a higher perspective in which we can approach this problem. And that is rising up and away from this kind of fear-based state where we're desperately trying to avoid an addiction, a relapse, and into a state where we begin paying attention and focusing on what is the lesson that is to be learned here. What is this situation, this addiction trying to teach me about myself? Because the moment you learn the lesson, the moment you learn about yourself, why you are engaging in this, and how you may satisfy this instinct in a more healthy way, perhaps. The moment you learn what the addiction is trying to teach you about yourself, you can solve the problem, and then the addiction is no longer necessary. Because the addiction is always going to be a cope. It's always going to be an unhealthy way to satisfy a very real need. And in this case, satisfying the sexual instinct. Or it could be satisfying the desire for intimacy. But it begins with awareness and self-discovery, learning about yourself and why am I engaging in this action in the first place? Why do I feel like I need this? Because healthy people who love themselves do not need to engage in unhealthy and self-destructive behavior. And so there is something that needs to be addressed. And so I would suggest one or two paths, or both perhaps. One is that if you are in your 20s, spend all of your time and your energy and your focus on creating yourself to be a man that women want to be with. Develop your character. Develop your value. Build something. Rise a bit in society. Because the fact is, if you are in your early to mid-20s, girls just will not be that attracted to you. Because you have nothing to show, you haven't built any value. The point I'm trying to make here is that the sexual instinct will need to be satisfied one way or another. It will not be denied no matter what you do. And it will force you to go down unhealthy paths if you do not find a way to direct that sexual instinct in a healthy way. So take the time to build yourself as a man, and even remain celibate during this time. And celibacy does not mean abstaining from sex, abstaining from pornography or masturbation. Celibacy means abstaining from any sexual thoughts or desires whatsoever. You do not think about women, and if you do, you just allow the thought to come and go without attachment to it. And a quick note, the reason that people relapse in the first place, it never begins in the moment when you start watching pornography. It always begins with a thought that is ruminated upon. A sexual thought enters the mind, and then we follow it, or that we keep that tension in our minds by thinking about it, by resisting it. And so the tension builds and the tension builds, and then eventually we have to release that tension. It's too much for us to handle. And so if you want to minimize the chances of a relapse, first of all, we have to control the mind. We have to build the strength and the ability to remain in the present moment through meditation. We have to avoid all the triggers that we know will eventually lead us down this path. For most people, that will be social media. This means logging out of all your accounts and deleting the apps. And don't fool yourself into believing that it's not a big deal, I'll go on social media for a bit. Because it will always lead you to that same conclusion, no matter how hard you try to convince yourself. And if you can, get out of any environment that is conducive to self-destructive behavior and bad habits and vices and pornography addiction. Because no matter how hard we try, it is very difficult to overcome the energy of the environment. It can be overwhelming. And it's not just about specifically any particular addiction. It could be a messy house. It could be a house where people smoke cigarettes. Any added stress will decrease your willpower. That is why when we face stressful situations, we always return to our addictions, because that is the path of least resistance. We have already built the grooves in our brain, so it's easy to just, okay, I'm going to fall back to what I know. And to return back and speak about the second path, I would say that another way that one can approach this situation, one could use fapping as a spiritual practice or a meditative practice, because we all have sexual energy within us, and the sexual energy will need to either be used in such a way or transmuted towards something else. And if your sexual energy is too powerful, then sometimes it is better to just use that opportunity to master your sexuality. Rather than avoid it through celibacy, you dive deeper into it, and of course avoiding pornography at all costs, but also to be able to engage in sexual energy without needing to release that sexual energy. And so you can condition yourself over time through this kind of sexual meditative practice. And also that when you finally do find yourself in a relationship, you will be of much better use to your sexual partner, because you have spent the time conditioning yourself and mastering your sexual energy. Now, of course, this can be dangerous because we can use this as a type of spiritual bypassing in which we just revert to our old ways, to our addictions. And it's difficult because we may fall back to the old grooves regardless. And so you have to discover for yourself what is the best thing for you. But fundamentally, approach this addiction or the journey of no fap or semen retention. Approach it from a place of self-discovery and self-awareness, self-mastery, rather than avoiding something or desiring something else. Whether you relapse or not, it's all a learning experience. Every moment there is something to be learned about yourself. So there's no need to be so heavily attached to the negative emotions. Remain non-attached and discover yourself. Master yourself.